With that said, this class today is a continuation of the last class we had last term, and that was indeed about naval warfare at the Battle of Jutland. Some of you may remember that class. This will be like the part 2 of that class, where we will continue to look at naval blockade in World War I and how that was an amazingly important aspect of total war. So with that said, let's get started with World War I. Blockade is total war. So the prospect of blockade, obviously to prevent people from getting goods and supplies in, was not really thoroughly analyzed by any of the major powers previous to World War I. The British thought, well, hey, there's no problem. We've got the world's largest navy. We will be using our surface power to make sure that nothing gets into Germany. And indeed, that was their plan. They were going to starve the Germans for materials and food. So you can see, they really thought that they had no issues. The Germans, on the other hand, had a totally different idea about it and didn't really think much about blockade either. And that is the fact that the Germans assumed that they were going to win the war in 6 to 8 weeks. So if they were going to win the war in 6 to 8 weeks, blockade's not a problem. The other piece with Germany, of course, is that Germany does not import as much food as Great Britain does. In fact, they only import 20% of their total food supply. So again, they didn't think blockade was going to be a problem. So neither side really put much effort into this, to thinking about what blockade really would be like. Well, the German Empire really relies on fertilizer imports. We did talk about a gentleman named Fritz Haber, and Fritz Haber indeed creates a way to make artificial fertilizer, very famous. But the fact of the matter is most of the production that was used by Fritz Haber was used to make explosives. So they didn't really have a huge surplus of fertilizer to grow food. So that's a major thing for them. The British, of course, they have their huge navy. They're not really worried about this, and they think there's not going to be a problem. The Germans, of course, have a different aspect in that their navy is the High Seas Fleet, which they've expended an incredible amount of money on, but they aren't positive that the High Seas Fleet is going to be able to break the blockade, but they're certainly hoping that it will be able to do that. So the Germans will, of course, have to come up with something different. So they will use two things. They will use surface raiders, which we talked about in regards to things like the CSS Alabama, and they will begin to do something later in the war that will be known as unrestricted submarine warfare. Well, the British are going to have blockade, and they're going to use this for two particular reasons. The first reason they want to have the blockade is they're hoping that the German High Seas Fleet will come out and fight them. And if they come out and fight them, then what the British expect is they're going to have a Trafalgar-like battle, and they're going to crush the German fleet in a day, and England will rule the waves as they always have. Of course, what we saw is the Battle of Jutland. This doesn't necessarily take place. Indeed, they do bottle up the German fleet, but the German fleet is certainly not destroyed in a Trafalgar-like manner. So they always will remain a fleet in being. The other piece is they're hoping, of course, is that the long war, then indeed they will starve Germany for resources and for food. What they don't understand is by declaring a war zone blocking all commerce into Europe, is that this is going to infuriate the United States. We all think about generally that when the United States went into the war, they were very, very mad about German U-boats, which is indeed true. But the fact of the matter is, at the beginning of the war, the United States was very, very angry at everybody because anybody that would restrict our ability to have trade is going to be a problem. Now, one key thing I need to bring up right here is in World War I, unlike in World War II, the Germans did not invade Holland. So Holland is always a port that the Germans expected to use to bring in resources, expecting a British blockade of the continent. So that's a major piece that goes on here. But what also happens, again, is with the British having this major blockade, they've now infuriated the United States. So how are they going to get around this? Because the United States is very, very mad about this, because they're expecting to trade with everybody and make a huge profit on the war. So the war is going to be very, very profitable for the United States, so they think. Well, the British come up with a great idea. First of all, they're going to maintain the price of cotton at pre-war levels and guarantee that any cotton that comes around their way that they will purchase. So that buys off the cotton trade of the United States. The second thing they do, which is probably even more radical, is they decide that any ship that lands in Britain from the United States, they will automatically, if there's any contraband on that ship, they will buy it. So everything that comes in, they just buy it. And if they don't really think it's contraband, then it perhaps could go on to Amsterdam, for example, to be offloaded. But really, they have come up with a great plan in order to make sure that Germany is blockaded by just basically buying off the United States with this policy.
The last sentence there seems to indicate that some ships were also stopped on the sea, not just in the ports.
Yes. Yeah, some are stopped on the seas. But generally, they would bring them into port then and make sure. So if nobody could sneak by, that's really the idea of it. Yes?
Did they actually inspect the cargo, or did they just go by the bill of lading?
They would actually inspect the cargo. The question was, did they actually inspect the cargo? And yes, they would. They would actually inspect the cargo. Yes, Ellen?
You said in the first slide that Germany imported 20%. I didn't see a figure for what the UK had to import.
Oh, I will get to that, but it's about 2/3 of their food is imported. Yes?
If they actually inspected the cargo, they literally unload the ship.
Yes. They would literally unload the ship and take the cargo. And pay, well, yeah, they pay for it. So they were really, really making sure that nothing was getting into Europe that they didn't have control of. So again, even like neutral ships, food is considered a contraband of war. This is very, very unprecedented. Normally, food is not considered contraband. So they have made a conscious effort to totally starve Germany out. And they are pretty successful, as we'll see in this class, about doing that as the war goes on. But again, that's kind of against international law. So again, what they would do is they would come in and the ship would dock in England. They would inspect the cargo. The cargo, if it was illegal contraband, would be removed from the ship. Any cargo that was not deemed illegal would then be transported through the British minefields. Keep that in mind, that they've got minefields out there. And those ships would then be escorted into perhaps Amsterdam. Yes?
Is this the beginning of total war? That you have this power, or you assume this power, that you're taking on the population as well as the military and government?
That is the entire point of this class.
Is this a major pivot point or a major?
I would say with the large, remember we talked about the giant increase in populations and the fact that food has now become movable because of techniques and technology. Yes, indeed, food has now become a critical thing because the population of the planet has gone from 700 million to approximately this time to about almost 2 billion. So food, especially in Europe, which is densely populated, is extremely important. We could go on about this for a long time. I'm not going to, but there's a lot of thought process that during World War II that this is a factor in the Holocaust as well. So read Adam Tooze, The Wages of Destruction, his book about World War II Nazi Germany economy. I'm sure you'll find that extremely interesting if you can stay awake while you read it. It's tough. Anyway, so we got this illegal cargo. It's going to Holland and it's going through minefields. Okay, so the thinking is really this, that great navies are great power. And that comes from a gentleman called Alfred Thayer Mahan. Mahan is a captain in the United States Navy, and he writes a very famous book about the influence of sea power. He states, "It is not the taking of individual ships or convoys, be they few or many, that strikes down the money power of a nation. It is the possession of that overbearing power on the sea which drives the enemy's flag from it, closes the highways by which commerce moves to and from the enemy shores. The overbearing power can only be exercised by great navies." But he means by that is great battle fleets. So he is a huge proponent of capital ships, large fleets, and that is what will control the nation's wealth and capability to win wars. He does recognize that indeed raiders can be a problem, like the CSS Alabama was a problem for the United States during the American Civil War, but they are only going to be a nuisance. They are not capable of influencing sea power on any sort of major way. Well, another person that's relatively famous at this time is a man called Fred Jane. Some of you may be familiar with Fred's work. He is the person that came up with Jane's Fighting Ships. And that's the very famous, and still published today, about a document where you can look up every ship in every navy and see their capabilities. And this thing became like a Bible for most of the navies of the world. Fred says that there is no country in the world that is more susceptible to commerce raiding than the United Kingdom. And indeed, he's correct on this. So he is really saying that Britain had better watch out, even though they have this great navy, that indeed they're still susceptible to problems with commerce raiders. Well, the Germans are going to come up with a completely new commerce raider, and of course that commerce raider is going to be the submarine. So let's talk a little bit about the rules, the laws of the sea when it comes to commerce and prize taking and raiders. And that is codified primarily in 1907 at the Second Hague Conference, and it is further elaborated upon in the London Agreement of 1908. And the law is this: if I capture a merchant ship is not armed, it's not a warship, it's carrying cargo. If I capture that ship, I have a responsibility. My responsibility is simply this: I have to make sure the crew gets into its lifeboat safely. I have to make sure that the crew has food and water and the navigation capability in order to get to a port of safety. I have an obligation that if the weather is bad, that I will make sure that crew is taken aboard my ship and, again, delivered to safety. All these things are codified, as well as also as the sea mine, because remember, the sea mine is just a mine. It has no brain, and it is subject to damaging neutral ships as well, just because they blunder into them. So there's a lot of aspects of this, but the submarine is now, because of the London Agreement, is subject to these rules. Except 44 nations signed the London Agreement. Not a single nation will ratify it. So the question stands then, is indeed this the law of the sea? And most people would say yes, it is, per 1907. But the fact of the matter is simply this: nobody really ratifies this. So at the start of World War I, of course, the United States bitterly objects to things that are going on the ocean. But again, most people just don't pay any attention to them. So we've got a huge issue here, is submarines are viewed at this time as being completely unable to be a commerce raider because they cannot supply any of these things or guarantee the safety of these crews. So even before the intervention and these conventions, we have the British talking about submarines. And A.K. Wilson, the admiral, goes, they are underhanded, unfair, and damned un-English. And of course, if we capture any of those people, we're going to treat them as pirates and hang them. Well, I tend to think this is pretty much a bunch of British propaganda, because as we're going to see in this lecture, indeed, the British at the start of World War I have more submarines than any other country. So it's a bunch of bull. But it makes for, people love this quote, so I thought I'd throw it out. Okay, how does a submarine work? And this is certainly something that would only be capable of being created during the Second Industrial Revolution. So submarines have a lot of technology going on. First of all, you have two hulls, and you look at the left picture, you have an inner hull and an outer hull. The inner hull is called a pressure hull. And the reason it's called a pressure hull is because as you go deeper underwater, the weight of the water puts more and more pressure upon you. Those of you that scuba dive or dive regularly, you will know that every 33 feet the water pressure will double. So the crew and the machinery are all inside a pressure hull. The pressure hull is generally round because that will distribute pressure better. So that's what's going on in the middle. Okay? On the outside, you have your main hull and your ballast tanks. And by filling your ballast tanks, you will be able to do two things. You will be able to have a change in buoyancy. And that is absolutely critical to how submarines work. So now, when you have the ballast tanks full of water, the submarine will sink. When you want to go back up, what you will do is you will use high pressure air in steel cylinders, again, something that would only be capable of having in the Second Industrial Revolution, to blow that water out of those ballast tanks and bring the submarine back up to the surface. So generally what you're doing is you're operating that submarine probably slightly negatively buoyant, and you're using the planes, which act like wings or flaps on an aircraft, to keep that thing rising slightly, and you use the engine power underwater to drive it and to keep it basically level. So that's kind of how a submarine works in a simple version. The biggest important thing with submarines, though, is make sure they have balance. Because the submarine is operating now in a new world. It is operating in a three-dimensional world. So the submarine can go up and down and left and right, whereas on land you just do that. So submarines, when they are below the surface, are very much like an aircraft. So they have a bow trim tank and a stern trim tank to make sure that submarine stays level. The other thing that's really important too now is if I fire a torpedo, what has happened? I have drastically reduced the amount of weight in that submarine. So I have to compensate for that immediately, because when you fire a torpedo in this era, you fired it pretty much close to the surface because you were looking through the periscope or whatever so you could see what you were shooting at. So the obvious thing there is now when I fire a torpedo, I've got to immediately get water back into that submarine to keep it in balance and keep it from jutting up to the surface. The other thing is as I use fuel, the same thing applies. I have to continually add water into the fuel tanks. Fortunately, the fuel is lighter than water, so it floats to the top. It will not mix. And I continually add water into my fuel tanks to keep my submarine in balance. So balance is incredibly important to these ships at this time. Okay, so now what we've seen is a lot of development going into submarines from this time onward. Because remember, we started with the Turtle in the American Revolutionary War. We talked about the CSS Hunley in the American Civil War. All of those were powered by muscle, and they were very difficult to keep in balance. Particularly the Hunley, which killed 2 of its crews because it got out of balance and stuck on the bottom of the bucket in the mud. So balance is critical, and the development of these things gets more and more and more complicated. So they're going to use, originally for motorized submarines, they're going to try to use steam power. Well, steam power is very, very ineffective for a submarine. First of all, the engines are very large. Second of all, is they throw a tremendous amount of heat. So the submarine becomes untenable because it's too hot and it's too much space. Then they try to use gasoline engines. And gasoline engines are pretty good, but unfortunately they don't have much range. And another problem is if I'm in a sealed compartment and I have gasoline fumes, then indeed one spark, boom, no more submarine. And they will also use kerosene at some point. But the problem with all of these methodologies is the fact that these engines, when they're underwater, all use a tremendous amount of air. So it is not until the invention of the lead-acid battery, and I'm not going to talk a lot about lead-acid batteries because you all have one in your car, so think you're pretty familiar with these, that there's a capability to function underwater without using tremendous amounts of air. So the lead-acid battery is what will allow submarines at this time to function underwater in a practical manner. So the first practical submarines are created by this guy, John P. Holland. And John Holland is how would I put this? He's a brilliant engineer disguised as a school teacher. John Holland is a radical Irish patriot. He hates the British. And he's do anything he can to defeat the British Navy and free Ireland from the yoke of British power. And he gets in with this group called the Fenians, and they basically forerunners of the IRA. And they start to fund him because they think that he's got a great idea in order to destroy the British Navy. And so he starts building a thing called the Fenian Ram, and he actually launches this thing in 1881, and it's pretty close to a modern submarine. Now, if you want to see the Fenian Ram, you can. If you go to Paterson, New Jersey, and go to the Patterson Museum, the Fenian Ram is indeed available to be seen. Many other of these very, very early submarines are still around as well. There's a Holland type in Britain. The U-1, the first German submarine, is available to be seen at the Deutsches Museum in Germany. So surprisingly, a large number of these very early submarines are available. So Holland continues to perfect this Fenian Ram, but he's fidgeting on it, and he's fussing with it, and it's going on and on and on in time. And finally, the Fenians say, look, enough, we've had enough of you. They steal the submarine, literally steal it, and they now have it, but nobody knows how to operate it except for Holland. So they can't use it. But he continues to perfect submarines, and eventually his submarines incorporate many of the aspects we'd expect a modern submarine to have. But one thing, it doesn't have a periscope. Periscope technology has not been available yet because when they're underwater, they're going to wiggle because going through the water, right? And so that distorts the image. And the second thing is they tend to leak. And the last thing you want in a submarine is a lot of leaks. So he comes up with these two little, if you look at the red circles there, you can see that there's little peepholes there so you can look out and not have a periscope. But everything else pretty much he has together on his submarines. So his early submarines are really only suited to coastal defense because they are powered by gasoline engines. Many of his contemporaries, Holland gets in with a company called, that we will become familiar with, the Electric Boat Company. And these people will sell submarines to anybody that wants to buy them. And strangely enough, considering he's an Irish patriot, one of their very first large customers is the British Navy. Remember those underhanded pirates that were going to hang? They're still buying all these submarines. So indeed, the British Navy buys a significant amount of submarines from the Holland Company. I think that's kind of odd, but it is kind of just the way it works out. Well, so the first U.S. Navy submarine is indeed going to be the Holland 6, and that submarine will be renamed the SS Holland, or USS Holland, excuse me, or SS-1. And indeed, they buy this thing in 1900, and they pay $150,000 for it. And that's a loss leader. They lose money on this submarine. But today, The Electric Boat Company, which is a division of General Dynamics, makes all our nuclear submarines. So indeed, this was a really good business investment for them to sell this thing cheap to the United States Navy. The Holland 6, or the SS-1, is armed with a single Whitehead torpedo tube. It has got 2 reloads, and it has in the front, as you can see in this circle, it has a dynamite gun, which is basically an air-powered cannon to fire a low-velocity shell from. So basically the idea was that he'd fire a torpedo, then you would pop up, you would fire a couple shots with this cannon, then you'd go back underwater. The Holland is, like I said, it's pretty good. It has a crew of 6. It can make 6 knots surfaced. It can make 5.5 knots underwater. Now again, 5.5 knots is pretty darn slow. I'm sure everybody here can pretty much jog that fast. But it only has a range of 230 miles on the surface, and it has a underwater range of 35 miles on its lead-acid batteries. So it's basically a coastal defense weapon. It doesn't have the capability. The next major change, though, in submarines is it would be really great, people think, if submarines could go further. But they can't because of their engine power. And that changes with this gentleman, Rudolf Diesel. And what does he create? How about the diesel engine? Now, why is this different? All right, our typical gas engine has a spark plug and there's compression, and then that blows up the gasoline fumes and it makes power. Diesel engine doesn't have spark plugs. It's the compression of that diesel engine that will set off that explosion. And it doesn't need gasoline. It can use a much less volatile fuel. So that's a huge advantage. So 2 things with diesel engines is you can A, go a lot further on a tank of fuel, and 2, or B, you will not have the volatile gasoline inside that cylinder that you're living in where a spark could blow up the submarine. So you got 2 big advantages with diesel. Diesel also is pretty ahead of his time. And he thinks to himself, we don't really even need petroleum. We can make fuel for these types of engines out of plants. So he actually has already, by 1900, thought about biodiesel, which we use today. So he's very, very ahead of his time. Unfortunately, in 1913, on his way to England to sell his patents to the British Navy, he dies a mysterious death. Some people think that he is murdered by the British government, or excuse me, by the German government, and some people think that he just committed suicide. I don't know. It makes for a great conspiracy movie, so look him up online and you can make your own opinion. But I tend to think he probably committed suicide. Well, the first submarine to use a diesel engine is going to be a French submarine. It's a very low-powered diesel engine, only has 150 horsepower. But this French submarine in 1905, now remember, it's only 5 years later since the U.S. bought a Holland, this thing can go 1,300 miles on the surface, not very fast, but 1,300 miles, and it can go very, very slowly underwater because it's a larger submarine, 65 miles on lead-acid batteries. So we see in just 5 years a tremendous improvement in the capability of submarines. Well, as the diesel continues to improve, by 1914 the MAN company in Germany has created an engine that will produce 1,200 horsepower. It is small enough to fit into a submarine, and it has tremendous fuel economy. So the next class of German submarines that will come out, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, is the U-31 class. And the U-31 class will have a range of 10,000 miles. So now submarines are indeed a really, truly an ocean-going vessel, and they are going to be used by the navies at that time to be the eyes of the fleet and to be perhaps pick off a ship or two with a torpedo. But really what they want to use them for is to be used as scouts. Well, the lead-acid battery does not keep up with the capability of diesel engines. In fact, in World War II, until the German Type 21, which they call the Electro boat, which is basically a submarine basically stuffed full of lead-acid batteries, these submarines, even in World War II, can only go about 100 miles on an extremely slow speed on a charge of batteries. So the lead-acid battery is certainly something that never ever catches up with the technology available for submarines until it is replaced by the nuclear power. And when nuclear power becomes a reality, then indeed submarine becomes truly a submersible ship. So if we look at the top picture, you can see a Type 7 German U-boat from World War II. And you can see it has a typical hull. It has a deck. It's a surface ship that occasionally can go underwater. The lower picture you see is a modern submarine. It looks more like a fish. It's totally round. It's meant to be underwater all the time. And of course, when it's on the surface, it's actually relatively unwieldy and not very good surface ship whatsoever. But it isn't designed to be that. So the second industrial revolution, what it does is it creates an entirely new type of ship. It creates a ship, when armed with the Whitehead torpedo, will become a movable minefield. Not like today's submarines, but look at it this way. When it's underwater, it's very slow. When it's underwater, it only goes a very short distance. So don't look at it as like a regular warship. Look at it more like a movable minefield, because that's really more what it was like. But what it will also become is an incredibly potent commerce raider. So at the start of World War I, the submarine fleets are relatively small. They're made up of multiple types of boats. Some of these boats are incredibly obsolete already. Some of them are not. The Germans have a fleet, the Russians, everybody has a fleet. But the British have the largest fleet of 74 ships. The French have the second largest fleet of 62 ships. The Russians have 48, and the Germans have a total of 29. But the Germans have sat back and let all this technology sort of look at it and find ways to maybe make things better. And the Germans have another advantage, is they control the best diesel engines in the world. So the new Type 31 class that they are building at the beginning of World War I, 10 are under construction, will be the most capable U-boats or most capable submarines in the world. Some people will argue and say that the British E-class is as good or nearly as good. They're pretty good, but these U-31s are, in my opinion, are a better ship. So anyway, the Germans, when the war actually gets going and they start getting these U-31 class into their fleet, will have the most capable submarine fleet in the world, even though it's very, very small. So at the start of the war, there is absolutely no defense against a submarine that's underwater. There is no capability whatsoever to attack that thing. You can't detect it. You don't know anything about it. You don't know where it is. The only time you can attack a submarine at this point in World War I is if it comes to the surface, or you see its periscope, or if it fires a torpedo, because torpedoes at this time are not electric powered and they are not oxygen powered, so they leave a stream of bubbles as they go towards their target. Well, that stream of bubbles will tell you where the submarine used to be. So perhaps you can run down that track and try to ram the submarine at that time. But the problem with that is hopefully that torpedo that it fired at you missed, because otherwise it doesn't really matter that you're trying to go attack that submarine. So the very, very first huge success of submarines takes place in September 22nd of 1914, so about a month plus 2 months almost into the beginning of the war in World War I. And the U-9 comes across 3 large British armored cruisers, the Albacore, Hogue, and Cressy. And they are on a patrol in the English Channel to prevent the Germans from commerce and basically a war patrol, basically guarding the English Channel. They are old ships, but they are still large. They have 12,000-ton ships, and they have crews of nearly 800 men each. And the U-9 comes across these things, and it fires a torpedo at the Albacore, and it hits it, and the Albacore thinks it's been hit by a mine. Well, then what happens is the Cressy and the Hogue come to its aid. He sees the Hogue, and he fires a torpedo at that, and he hits the Hogue. And now the Hogue is sinking. And the Cressy still comes along and tries to rescue the crew of both these ships, was just sitting there, so he torpedoes that too. So in less than an hour, he has destroyed 3 12,000-ton ships and killed over 1,200 British sailors, more than are lost at the entire Battle of Trafalgar. Two things happen now. First thing is the British realize, oh man, these submarines can be a problem. Second thing that happens is, and this is kind of sad, is ships will no longer wait or try to rescue survivors if there's a submarine nearby. They cannot do that. So now basically they have to abandon people in the water, hightail it out of there, and then hopefully later they can send back small ships to rescue survivors. They can't stop and rescue survivors because they put their own ship at risk. Yes?
The date of 27 September 22nd. When was the war declared?
August 1st. So about 2 months, a little less than 2 months. So the U-9 was commanded by Otto Wiedingen. Otto Wiedingen becomes like a rock star in Germany. If you look at this picture, there's the Albacore, there's the Hogue, both sinking, one being torpedoed, and the picture of the U-9 is the circle with the 2 periscopes. That's all you can see of it. So I thought maybe I better highlight that for you so you could actually see where the U-9 was. And this is actually a postcard that was made in Germany to honor this victory. Wiedingen later goes on to sink the Hawk, which is a protected cruiser. So he's a ship killer. I mean, this guy's a rock star. He gets command of the new U-29, which is a much more capable ship than the kerosene-burning U-9. And he sees the British battle fleet, the Dreadnought fleet, and he fires 2 torpedoes at the Thunderer. He misses. But what also happens is somebody makes a mistake, or else they have a mechanical failure. No one will ever know. And when he fires those 2 torpedoes, like I said, these ships now have got to be controlled to stay in balance. They lose balance. The U-29 goes to the surface, and it is rammed by the HMS Dreadnought. Again, 2 things. This is the only time in history where a battleship actually sinks a submarine. And the second thing is this is the only time in history the HMS Dreadnought actually did anything of note in World War I. So that is the end of Otto and the U-29, but he was a great captain. So with that said, let us take a short break, and let's try to get back here at 1:30, okay? The first attacks by submarines, German submarines, actually don't take place till October of 1914. Remember, the war started August 1st of 1914. So the Germans don't see U-boats as commerce raiders whatsoever, because again, it would be against the law to use them in this manner. So they don't see that as such an issue. But the other piece is the war's not going very well. We were supposed to win in 6 or 8 weeks. All of a sudden, it's February of 1915. We're still fighting. There's a giant trench line all the way from the from the Channel to Switzerland. There's a major fighting going on in what is today Poland. So what the hell has gone wrong here? So they're starting to see that they got a problem because they're not winning the war anywhere quick enough, and all of a sudden that British blockade is starting to hurt. Well, they only managed to sink 19 ships in basically the first 6 months of the war, roughly. and that is 43,000 tons of shipping. That's not very much. Well, the British, of course, they've got that overwhelming sea power. They are going to starve the Germans out because they've made food contraband, and they've declared that the entire North Sea is a war zone. So if you send a neutral or regular ship in, of course, you are subject to war. Well, Germany can't really deal with this. They don't have a way, because their high seas fleet is not powerful enough to defeat the British fleet. The surface raiders they do have are basically only making an annoyance capability as per Mahanian thought process, or through his what he has discussed as what goes on with raiders. They don't have the power to control the seas. Well, the Germans decide at this point, because things are going so poorly, that they are going to have something called unrestricted submarine warfare. The Chancellor of Germany, Bethmann Hollweg, says, well, this isn't a good idea, guys. Maybe we shouldn't do this because this is going to really aggravate the United States and other non-European countries, so maybe this isn't a good plan. And indeed, they decide to go through with it anyway. And that's from Admiral Hugo von Pohl. He is the commander of the German High Seas Fleet, and he's going to publish a warning to the world. And that warning will read, the waters in Great Britain and Ireland, including the whole of the English Channel, are hereby declared to be a war zone. From February 18th onward, every enemy merchant vessel encountered in this zone will be destroyed, nor will it always be possible to avert the danger thereby threatened to crew and passengers. So in other words, they are not going to make provisions per the law of the Hague Convention of 1907. Secondly, neutral vessels will basically be subject to the same thing. So, if you're a neutral ship, and because the British have been starting to put neutral flags on their cargo ships to fool the Germans, indeed, they are going to be subject to attack without warning as well. So if you go into this zone, it's at your own risk. Well, Bethmann Hollweg has lost this political battle. And indeed, this will eventually lead to the United States and Brazil declaring war on Germany. So they are going to have unrestricted warfare. They've only sunk 43,000 tons. But as soon as they declare this, that tonnage starts to skyrocket. More and more and more ships are sunk now because they're using submarines as commerce raiders. What we've got to remember, though, is they've only got a few submarines. At the beginning of 1915, they only have 29 submarines, and many of these are obsolete. So at any given time, there's hardly any really submarines out on war patrols. And yet these submarines are starting to sink more and more and more tonnage. So by the end of 1915, they have sunk 1,307,996 tons of Allied ships, and this is a tiny force. So they're having a tremendous effect for the size of what they have, effort they have capability to do. Because, and we'll talk about this more, but basically you've got to look at submarines in thirds, and I'll get there. So in May 1915, until, of course, a disaster happens for the Germans. And that is the sinking of the Lusitania. The Lusitania is spent specifically, that ship is warned in the New York papers that American citizens should not get on this ship. There couldn't be any more blatant, saying if you get on a Lusitania, you're putting your life in danger. Indeed, many people think that the Lusitania, because she's so fast, has not got any issues with submarines. Well, unfortunately for the Lusitania, the U-20 happens to be exactly in the right place at the right time, and it's also believed that the captain of the Lusitania, as he was getting close to the port, had slowed the ship down. So what happens is the U-20 fires a single torpedo. When that single torpedo hits, it explodes, and then shortly thereafter there's a large secondary explosion. At the time, the British covered this up very, very successfully. But with today, we know, and by reading the manifest, for example, on Lusitania, that indeed she was carrying illegal armaments. Also, divers have been on the Lusitania now with modern equipment. She's deep, but not super deep, so you can actually dive on it if you have the proper stuff. They've been inside the ship, and they know that the ship was carrying weapons. So the British basically had broken the law as well by putting U.S. passengers on a ship that was transporting armaments. So the Lusitania, 1,198 people die because it sinks so quickly. I believe 18 minutes is the number they give. And 128 of those passengers are U.S. citizens. The U.S. public goes crazy. They're totally angry. President Wilson sends 3 messages to Germany about this situation. And the third one says that any subsequent sinkings will be considered a deliberately unfriendly act. So in other words, the United States puts out an ultimatum to the Germans. Well, this goes on throughout the rest of the year. There's other incidents. And by the winter of 1915 into 1916, the Germans decide that they will no longer have unrestricted warfare because there's too much pressure put on them by the U.S. government. Well, we get through 1916, and the war is still not going well. In fact, the war is kind of going worse. So what happens then is Admiral von Holzendorf, and using mathematical work from a Dr. Fuss says, if we could sink 600,000 tons of British shipping a month, we can bring Germany can bring Britain to its knees. And all this can be accomplished before the U.S. gets into the war because the U.S. Army is very small, the U.S. Army is undisciplined and disorganized, and so the United States won't really be a problem. And then Holzendorf tells the Kaiser, I give your majesty my word as an officer that not one American will land on the continent. Well, unfortunately, he's not very right on that one. So, by late 16, the Germans are getting more and more desperate, like I said. They've got 150 divisions versus 190 divisions of the Entente. Their surface fleet was unable to break the blockade with the Battle of Jutland, for example, and other forays. And Hindenburg, who's the charge of the German army, tells the Kaiser, he says, look, we're in trouble here. We got to get something done right away. So indeed, the Kaiser buckles under to Hindenburg, much to the dismay of Bethmann-Hollweg, and he agrees on the 31st of January to sign unrestricted submarine warfare back into law. So the Germans again declare unrestricted submarine warfare. Bethmann-Hollweg says Germany is finished. He has no faith that this is going to win the war. And of course, on April 6th, 1917, the United States declares war on Germany. The Germans have been building their submarine fleet, and of course their submarine fleet has got newer, better models, particularly types advanced, even more advanced than the U-31 class, and some very, very solid smaller type submarines too. And they're going to be able to put 105 submarines out there. They've got 46 in the high seas fleet, 23 in Belgian ports, 23 in the Mediterranean, 10 in the Baltic, and 3 in Constantinople. They are also going to continue to build submarines, more and more submarines, until they feel that they will have a force of 120 submarines at any given time, regardless of losses. So with 120 submarines, the way the submarines work, 40 are out on war patrol, 40 are coming to and from war patrol, and 40 are in port or under construction. So always look at submarine forces in thirds. That's the best way to see what their actual capability is. So early in World War I, in 1915, we saw that the unrestricted warfare was able to sink 1.3 million tons with hardly any U-boats at all out in the Atlantic. Now they've got a lot of U-boats. And so the tonnage starts to rise exponentially. You see in the first month, February, they sink 500,000 tons, 860,000 tons in April. The British supply of wheat drops to 6 weeks. They're starting to lose plus 600,000 tons every month, and the Germans only lose 9 U-boats. It's starting to work. 25% of all British-bound shipping is sunk in March alone. So, and it's a time of great, great success by what the people that will become the most or not powerful, but the greatest U-boat commanders, aces in history, all come from this time, not from World War II. The vast majority, the top 3 in the world, all come from here. Most of the top 10 comes from here. And we'll talk about number 1. Lothar von Arnold de la Perrière. De la Perrière comes late to the U-boat. He's not until 1915 that he's transferred. He takes command of the U-35. He makes 14 war patrols. In those 14 war patrols, this guy sinks 189 ships and 2 gunboats. He sinks over, 446,708 tons. That's almost 500,000 tons, one guy. He then takes command of a large cruising submarine, U-139 late in the war, and sinks 5 more ships. He is undoubtedly the greatest submarine commander in history. What is his secret? He's fighting in the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean is not nearly as well defended. And the other piece with La Perrière, he is surfacing, stopping ships, using his 88 millimeter cannon to sink them by shooting into their hull, and then he can sail away and sink vastly more ships than firing torpedoes because he doesn't have to stay underwater all the time. He only fires 74 torpedoes in the entire war and makes a very, very credible amount of 39 hits. And I think that there's not a submariner in the world at this time that wouldn't have taken better than 50% hit rate. So he's a solid guy. His 14th patrol is the greatest patrol in history. He sinks in one 3-week period 54 ships totaling 90,350 tons. The U-35 also has another distinction. It sinks the SS Californian. And those of you that are familiar with the Titanic would know that the Californian was the ship that received the Titanic's radio signal and refused to come to its aid. So the Californian succumbs to the U-35 as well. Well, we've seen that the British were indeed the leaders in anti-submarine, or in submarine war at the beginning of the war. They had the most submarines, I guess, the best way to put it. But they haven't done much about figuring out ways to counteract submarines. In 1913, they begin to try to use explosives underwater to attack submarines. These aren't very successful, and they basically abandon the process. In the middle of 1914, a British company developed something called the hydrostatic pistol. The hydrostatic pistol is simply this. The same pressure I talked about on a submarine hull doubling every 33 feet, a hydrostatic pistol operates the same way. As it goes deeper in the water, more and more pressure is put upon it until it is set to trigger at a certain depth. So when that pressure is reached, it fires, and then indeed it causes the explosion of the explosive charge that it's going to take off. So it's a fuse in effect. So the hydrostatic pistol is not invented until 1914, shortly before the war. By 1916, the British have created the first practical depth charge called the Type D. The Type D depth charge is basically a garbage can with 300 pounds of explosives and a hydrostatic pistol. A couple problems with these is that if normally at this time they would set the depth at only 45 feet, because submarines didn't go very deep in World War I, generally. So But what happened then is unless you were going pretty darn fast, when you rolled that thing off the stern, when that 300 pounds goes off, it's very likely going to damage the back of your ship. So you have a problem there with the large depth charge on a slow ship. So then they would create smaller depth charges for slower ships. So depending on how fast your ship was, you would use a 300-pound or a 200-pound charge. Well, these things can destroy a submarine if they explode within 20 or 40 feet. They will rupture the pressure hull, or they will at least do enough damage to force the submarine to the surface where it can be attacked. Well, problem that still exists is, where is the submarine? I can't see it, it's underwater, so where do I drop these things? So again, you only have the option if you see a periscope, if the submarine broaches the surface, or indeed if you go down the track of a torpedo. So there's still no good way, basically, to attack a submarine because you can't find it. The most successful way to create or destroy submarines is to use mines. Mines are the single largest killer of submarines in World War I, and they are successfully used, for example, in the English Channel. Now, the problem with mines with a submarine is the submarine can be underwater or up on the surface. So when you make a minefield, you have to set mines at all different depths, so that hopefully a submarine will run into one of these mines. That's a pretty expensive process. So if something narrow like the English Channel, which at the narrowest is like 20 miles wide, you can use this type of a minefield. But the British want to do something vastly more aggressive, and that is to create a minefield all the way from Norway to Scotland. And they really, really want to do this. But the problem is, they're going to need 400,000 mines in order to make this mine barrage. Well, when the U.S. joins the war in April of 17, then indeed they now have the resources of the United States, and Franklin Roosevelt, who's the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, is very much into this plan. And he's pushing hard that the United States get involved with this. There's one other huge advantage, is the United States creates a new type of mine, and that mine is the Mark VI sea mine. So how does this differ? You take a Mark VI and you plant it on the ocean floor, floating slightly above it. Then there's an antenna that floats above that, and that makes the mine that much bigger vertically than it would be as a regular mine. So you don't need to lay mines at all different depths. This mine functions as basically one mine. So instead of needing 400,000 mines to make this giant barrage, they now only need 100,000, which is still a huge effort. And so in early 1918, they begin to lay the mine barrage. And by the end of the war, they have laid 70,000 of these mines. So it's a huge undertaking, but it is going forward. It does sink a significant number of U-boats. But of course, at the end of the war, you got to clean up this minefield. You got 70,000 mines blocking the North Sea. So it's not a very great plan, but indeed they make the effort to do that. Well, why don't we use sonar? Why don't we use that? Well, it hasn't been invented yet. So the first version of this, and people are aware of how this works. They know that bats, for example, emit sound, and it bounces back to the bat, and then the bat knows what it's going after. They also know that dolphins do the same thing. That the dolphin emits a sound, it bounces off its lunch, and then it knows where its lunch is. And they know this is, but they don't have the electronic capability to do much with it. It's with the loss of the Titanic, though, that this becomes much more of a search, because they want to be able to find icebergs. And the gentleman, Lewis Fry Richardson, shortly after the Titanic, puts the first patent out on this capability. By 1914, the technology has gone far enough where they can detect an iceberg at about 2-mile range. Of course, an iceberg is extremely bigger than a submarine. So it is not the process goes on, and they bring in the very best people they can, including Ernest Rutherford, the famous physicist, is brought in to work on this process, and they create ASDIC, as they call it. We call it sonar. And they have a workable model that's pretty reliable by 1920. Of course, by then the war is over. So they never really developed this capability. They do develop another capability, though, which is the hydrophone, which is a microphone that functions underwater. Now, what happens with that is people think in the United States, we refer to our submariners as the silent service. Submarines are anything but silent at this time. There's the cavitation of their props, there's the noise of the machinery, and sound is transmitted very, very well underwater. So, by using hydrophones, they can begin to try to locate submarines underwater. And indeed, by April 23rd of 1916, they do succeed in sinking the UC-3 German U-boat using hydrophones. So hydrophones are starting to catch up with some more technology to find submarines underwater. Perhaps the largest single effort they come up with is the Q-ship. The Q-ship looks like a tramp steamer. So if you can't find a submarine underwater, we need to find a way to get the submarine to come up on the surface where we can attack it. So what they do is they basically create this tramp steamer, and they arm it with cannon, and the U-boat will surface to sink this thing because it looks defenseless, and they think they can get, no problem attacking this thing. And they'll sail on, and then these things have two crews. So they have one crew that is basically there to abandon ship. They'll have a panic party. They'll overturn a lifeboat. They'll look like, oh my God, there's a submarine. We got to get off the ship as fast as possible. When the crew gets in their lifeboats and sails off, what will happen then is the submarine will come closer, because the submarine's going to want to sink the ship with as little amount of firing shells as possible. So they'll get to point blank range. They'll have their crew on deck to man their deck gun, and when that happens, the Q-ship will then raise a flag. The second crew is still aboard, and guns will pop out of hidden areas, and they will begin to shell the German submarine. They make 200 of these Q-ships during World War I. They do manage to sink 14 U-boats. They damage 60 in 150 attacks. But 27 of these Q-ships are lost as well. And remember, these things have large crews, so they're not a very effective methodology to sink U-boats. And they are again tried in World War II and again proved relatively ineffective. The Germans catch on to this ruse relatively quickly. So I've given you a picture here. You can see the gun on a Q-ship. If you see that square or that rectangle I've got there, you can see that's where the hatch is opened up where this gun can fire. I am going to send you a video that's not really good, but it's the best I could find. I will send that to you via email later this week or today. And I would also recommend that if you have the capability, you look at a show called Drain the Ocean. Drain the Ocean is episode 7, season 2 is called Killer U-Boats, okay? These shows are always a little hokey with, killer U-boats and stuff, but there is some really great footage of Q-ships and submarines in this particular show. So I would recommend it. I will not send you a link to it because you would have to then either have Disney or Hulu or some other capability. So if you want to look up Drain the Ocean, and you can try to find this thing, and if you care to go to the trouble, or if you already have Disney or Hulu, then you can see the show. But I'm not comfortable sending you a link where you've got to do a lot of extra things. So, quite interesting. All right, so what is the way to defeat the submarine in World War I? And that way to defeat the submarine is indeed the convoy. The convoy is built on a few problems. There's thought process by the British Admiralty and there's the merchant captains, that they're opposed to this. Couple of things. First of all, the ships all have to wait in a port until they gather enough ships to go in a convoy. Then they have to be escorted by warships. So the warships are committed to following this convoy. When the convoy lands at the port in England, for example, the port facilities will be overwhelmed by the amount of ships coming in at one time. So they can't literally unload all these ships. So the whole process will slow down transport, and they feel this will be more detrimental than the U-boats are themselves. Another thing about convoys, though, is they're built on bad math. And it's simply this. Their argument against them is bad math. They claim that, well, if you put all your ships in one spot, then it'll be just easier for the U-boats to sink all the ships. But a single ship compared to a convoy, compared to the size of the ocean, is not really that much different. So there's not much difference between, it's not compared to the ocean, of a single ship compared to a convoy. And the other thing is a convoy, since it's condensed, there's not all these single ships flowing around where you can kind of bump into them more likely. There's all one big group. So it becomes much, much more difficult for a submarine to find ships. When they do find a convoy, because it's escorted, they can't surface and use their gun because the escorts will get them. So what happens is they now are forced only to use torpedoes. And remember, submarines are really slow underwater, so the convoy just kind of sails away from them. So they can't do as much damage as they could to individual ships. So the convoys really, really reduce the total numbers of sinkings. And also, because the submarines now have to come much more in contact with defending warships, the number of submarines that is sunk greatly increases. So historian Paul Fontenoy says, quote, "The convoy system defeated the German submarine campaign." So from June 1979, the sinkings drops. It's well below the 600,000 ton level. And the submarine itself, though, as we have seen, has gone from this unknown quantity. In only 17 years, it's now become a key killer of merchant ships. It is a key part of blockade. Submarine has gone a tremendous amount of capability in a very, very, very short time. And the convoy itself, though, the British, basically 22 years later have to relearn the lessons. When the World War II starts, they don't really want to deploy convoys again for the same reasons. Unfortunately for them, that's a bad idea. They needed to have convoys from day one, and they try to avoid it like the plague early on in the war. So they pay a price for that. So it's funny how only 22 years later you would forget something as vital as that. So during World War I, U-boats sink 5,000 ships. They nearly defeat England. The three greatest submarine aces, like Ital said, in all time come from this period. The Germans deployed a total of 351 U-boats. They sank 12,815 gross tons, almost 13 million tons of ship. They sink 10 battleships, no dreadnoughts, only pre-dreadnoughts, and 18 cruisers. But the submarine service is indeed, in World War I, World War II, the most dangerous thing to be part of for the people that are part of that service. No units have higher casualties than submarines as a type. So you could be in the infantry, you're going to survive, better chance. You could be in the Air Force, you have a better chance of survival. Being in a combat submarine is your least chance of survival in war. The Germans lose 178 out of 351 submarines deployed. They lose actually a lot more than that in World War II. So your survival rate is very, very poor. But the trade-off of 178 submarines and 5,400 men, considering they sank 5,000 ships, is a pretty darn good trade. So you can see the submarine is becoming a very, very important piece of modern warfare. Well, this whole class has been about blockade, believe it or not. It seems like it was all about submarines. But it's really about blockade. So, at the beginning of the war, by 1915, the blockade of Britain, or by Britain, of Germany has cut German imports down by 55%. Exports, where they would get money to pay for things, is down by 53%. They've had a tremendous loss of the capability to get fertilizer, so their crops are suffering. They have a huge potato crop failure in 1916, and that leads to what's known as the turnip winter. They have no potatoes to eat. And potatoes are a huge part of the German diet. They now have to subsist on Swedish turnips, which offer far less nutritional value. So, what happens then is by 1918, the German diet by rationing is down to 1,500 calories per day. In the cities, it's down to as low as 1,000 calories per day. What is that going to mean to the German population? It's going to mean that that food shortage is going to cause massive amounts of malnutrition. When you have malnutrition like that, and then comes the Spanish influenza, you have a much weakened immune system. So the casualties from the Spanish influenza, for example, in Germany compared to Britain, are far worse. The Germans suffer massively from the Spanish influenza and from malnutrition in general. So deaths from malnutrition, the estimates, and again, they're just estimates, are 424,000 dead to 763,000 dead from malnutrition. On top of that, another 200,000 to 400,000 Germans die from the Spanish influenza. So the Germans are suffering terribly from this blockade. The blockade continued after the armistice. The British continued to have blockade them until they signed the Treaty of Versailles. So if you ever wonder why the Germans were aggravated by the Treaty of Versailles or were angry about the results of World War I, you can easily point to the fact of this blockade being continued even after the armistice until they were forced to sign that treaty. It was total war. The war was against the German people as well as the German military. So we look at the blockade. It is a huge part of the reason that the Entente wins the war. It vastly reduced the war potential of the Central Powers. It really confirms the Mahanian theory that to control the oceans with a large fleet is certainly the way to help win the war. But Mahan, like I said, he didn't really think about submarines and how important that the submarine will become as a commerce raider. So, if we want to look at counterfactual history, we can look at it this way. If the Germans perhaps had spent a significantly larger portion of their economy rather than building a high-seas fleet and realizing the potential of the U-boat as a commerce raider, indeed they would have had more than 29 quality U-boats at the beginning of World War I. Had they then used those in unrestricted submarine warfare in 1915, it is possible that indeed they could have changed the outcome of World War I by strangling Britain at that point. So we'll never really know that, but what it really shows you is that the Germans had no idea what the potential of the submarine actually was at the beginning of the war. Nobody did. So they never really planned to use this or understand the total influence on sea power that the submarine would eventually have. So as we've seen today, blockade is indeed total war. It's no longer just war against a military. It is war against the manufacturing capability to create the weapons needed by modern armies that take so much technology and so much raw materials and indeed it becomes a war on the people that make those weapons.